There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their edges softened by routine. They slip into the rhythm of your days like a misplaced note in a familiar song, barely perceptible until long after they have passed, when the silence they leave behind forces you to look back. For me, that moment was a Tuesday night in late October. It wore the costume of exhaustion and the mundane comfort of my worn-out sofa, and it smelled like the clean, faint scent of sandalwood and citrus that always clung to Julian. He was asleep, his head resting heavily in the crook of my shoulder, his arm draped loosely across my chest. The weight of him was a profound and terrifying anchor, holding me in a state of suspended reality where I was both exquisitely happy and desperately afraid. This was the precipice. I knew it in the way the fine hairs on my arms stood on end, not from cold, but from a static charge that had been building between us for months. Every breath he took was a wave that washed over me, and every beat of my own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, praying he wouldn't wake up, praying he would never leave. I was a photographer. My life was a practice in observation, in waiting for the precise alignment of light and shadow, for the unguarded expression that reveals a hidden truth. I had spent years looking at the world through a lens, maintaining a necessary and comfortable distance. But with Julian, the lens had dissolved. There was no distance, no protective barrier of glass and metal. There was only the overwhelming, unfiltered reality of his presence. His eyelashes, dark and surprisingly long, rested against his cheek. A small, faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, a relic from a childhood bicycle accident he'd told me about one drunken evening. I knew the cartography of his face better than I knew any landscape I had ever photographed. I had studied it in stolen glances across dinner tables, in the flickering light of movie screens, in the soft glow of my apartment lamp as he talked himself to sleep on this very couch. But this was different. This wasn't observation. This was immersion. His warmth seeped through my shirt, a slow, spreading heat that felt less like temperature and more like an emotion, a feeling of being found after a long time of being lost. The television was muted, casting a silent, shifting kaleidoscope of blue and gray light across the room, painting his sleeping face in transient shades of drama and peace. A car chase unfolded without sound, a ballet of screeching tires and flashing lights that held none of the room's profound stillness. My own body was rigid, a statue carved from fear and longing. I was terrified to move, to breathe too deeply, to do anything that might shatter the fragile perfection of the moment. If I shifted, he might wake up. He might pull away, suddenly aware of the intimacy of his position, and the spell would be broken. The air would rush back in, thick with awkwardness and unspoken questions. The carefully constructed walls of our friendship, walls I had painstakingly reinforced for years, would show their cracks. And so I remained perfectly still, a willing prisoner, my muscles screaming in protest, my mind a turbulent sea of what-ifs. This was the edge of a cliff I had been walking toward in the dark, and for the first time, I could feel the open air at my feet. The only question was whether we were about to fall, or if, somehow, we were about to learn how to fly. We had met, quite literally, in the dark. A citywide power outage had plunged our pre-war apartment building into an abrupt and unnerving silence 2 years prior. The hum of refrigerators, the distant drone of televisions, the groan of the ancient elevator, all of it vanished, replaced by a thick, velvety blackness that felt ancient and alive. I had been in my darkroom, which was, ironically, the only place unaffected by the sudden loss of light. I was working on a series of architectural abstracts, trying to find the soul in the city's concrete and steel. When my timer went off and I emerged from the chemical-scented cocoon of my work, the absolute stillness of my apartment was the first sign that something was wrong. My digital clocks were blank. The sliver of light that usually crept under my front door was gone. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a blinding rectangle in the oppressive dark, and saw the network alerts confirming the outage. My first thought was of the prince soaking in the stop bath. My second, more primal thought, was a sudden and acute sense of isolation. I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from my emergency kit and ventured into the hallway, its powerful beam cutting a sharp, dancing circle through the gloom. The air was cool and smelled of dust and old wood, scents normally masked by the building's daily life. Other doors were opening, hesitant cracks of light appearing as my neighbors emerged, their voices hushed and uncertain. It felt primal, like a tribe gathering after a storm. And that's when I saw him. He was standing at the end of the hall, near the large window that overlooked the street, silhouetted against the faint, bruised purple of the twilight sky. He wasn't using a phone or a flashlight. He was just watching the darkened city, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He lived 2 doors down from me, in 4B. I knew this in the abstract way you know things about the people you share a building with. I'd seen him come and go, always looking sharp in a well-fitted suit or impossibly relaxed in worn-in sweatpants. He had a smile that he gave out freely in the elevator, a quick, bright flash of energy that always seemed to leave a little warmth in its wake. We'd exchanged the usual pleasantries, the nods and the how's it going, but nothing more. His name was Julian. I walked toward him, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the polished floorboards. "Looks like we're back in the Stone Age," I said, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the quiet. He turned, and even in the dim light, I could see that easy smile. "Tell me about it." I was halfway through a conference call with Tokyo. "I think they're going to assume I was abducted by aliens." His voice was smooth, with a low, reassuring timbre. It was a voice that could calm a nervous client or talk its way out of a speeding ticket. We stood there for a moment, 2 strangers connected by a shared inconvenience, looking out at the powerless metropolis. The city, usually a roaring, incandescent beast, was quiet and speckled with the pinpricks of emergency lights and the slow, sweeping beams of car headlights. It was beautiful, in a strange, apocalyptic way. "It's peaceful," I offered. He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the view. "It is. You forget how much noise there is until it's gone." We talked for what must have been an hour, leaning against the windowsill as the sky outside bled from purple to black. We didn't talk about the power outage. We talked like we already knew each other, skipping the tedious introductory steps. He told me about his job as a consultant, the endless travel, the soulless hotel rooms that all started to look the same. I told him about my photography, about trying to capture moments that felt more real than reality itself. He asked questions, real questions, not the polite, surface-level inquiries I was used to. He wanted to know what I looked for in a subject, how I knew when a picture was done. He listened with an intensity that made me feel seen, not just looked at. In the anonymity of the darkness, with our faces mostly in shadow, the conversation felt stripped of all pretense. It was just 2 people sharing a space, sharing their thoughts. It was then, in that unlit hallway, that the first seed of my affection for him was planted, a tiny, hopeful thing in the deep, quiet dark. The power returned with a sudden, unceremonious jolt. The hallway lights flickered on, harsh and yellow, chasing away the shadows and the intimacy they had held. We both blinked, momentarily blinded, like creatures of the night forced into the sun. The building groaned back to life around us, a symphony of reactivated appliances. The spell was broken. For a split second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, disappointment maybe, before it was replaced by that familiar, charming smile. "Well, I guess the aliens returned me," he said, pushing himself off the windowsill. "It was really nice talking to you." He trailed off, realizing he didn't know my name. "Leo," I supplied. "I'm Leo, Julian," he said, extending a hand. His handshake was firm, his palm warm. "Leo, good to finally meet you properly," and with a final nod, he turned and walked back to his apartment, leaving me alone in the now brightly lit hallway, my heart beating a little too fast, the echo of his voice still hanging in the air. That night was the foundation. From there, a friendship grew, easily and organically. It started with borrowing a cup of sugar, then escalated to him asking for my help hanging a heavy mirror. Soon, it was weekly movie nights, him sprawled on my floor with a bowl of popcorn, me on the couch, both of us dissecting the plot holes in bad action films. He had a key to my apartment for emergencies, which quickly became an open invitation. I'd come home from a shoot to find him on my sofa, laptop balanced on his knees, having let himself in because his own apartment felt too quiet. I loved those moments. I loved the casual domesticity of it, the way he fit into my space as if he were a part of its design. He was the splash of vibrant, chaotic color in my carefully composed, monochromatic life. He was loud and alive and left a trail of beautiful messes in his wake. A coffee mug on my bookshelf, a stray sock under the couch, the lingering scent of his cologne in the air. And all the while, that tiny seed of affection I'd felt in the darkened hallway grew, silently and persistently, into a vast, sprawling forest inside of me. It was a secret garden I tended to in private, a place of quiet yearning. I learned to live with the constant, low-grade ache of it. I became an expert at hiding it, at converting the tidal pull of my feelings into the acceptable currency of friendship. A desire to trace the line of his jaw became a friendly slap on the shoulder. A longing to tell him how his laughter was the best sound I'd ever heard became a simple, "You're an idiot." It was a delicate, exhausting dance of redirection. I was terrified of making the wrong move, of misinterpreting a signal and shattering the most important relationship in my life. He was a force of nature, a brilliant, warm front moving through my world, and I was convinced that if I ever confessed the truth of my feelings, he would retreat, and the light and warmth would go with him. So I kept my silence. I watched, and I waited, and I hoped for a sign that I wasn't just imagining the current that flowed between us. The shift came on a Wednesday. It arrived not with a bang, but with the weary slump of Julian's shoulders as he stood in my doorway, looking utterly defeated. The autumn rain was lashing against my windows, a relentless, percussive rhythm that mirrored the anxiety suddenly churning in my stomach. He was supposed to be in Chicago for a week, closing a massive deal his firm had been chasing for months. He wasn't supposed to be here, soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead and his suit, usually so impeccable, looking rumpled and sad. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, dripping onto my welcome mat, his eyes hollowed out with a fatigue that seemed to go clear to his soul. The usual bright energy that radiated from him was gone, replaced by a fragile, exhausted stillness. "The deal fell through," he said finally, his voice raspy. He didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. At the last minute, the client went with another firm. My boss is not pleased. He let out a short, humorless laugh that sounded more like a cough. I took the first flight back. I couldn't stand being in that hotel room for another second. I stepped aside, pulling the door wider. "Get in here, you're drowning my mat." My attempt at levity fell flat in the heavy air between us, but he complied, shuffling inside like an automaton. He left his wet shoes by the door and walked into my living room, shedding his suit jacket and dropping it unceremoniously onto a chair. He sank onto the sofa, the one that was becoming more his than mine, and buried his face in his hands. The sound he made was small and broken, the sound of a carefully constructed facade crumbling into dust. I didn't know what to do. The architecture of our friendship had clear blueprints. We joked, we watched movies, we offered practical advice. There was no protocol for this raw, unfiltered display of failure and exhaustion. My instincts screamed at me to go to him, to put my arms around him, to tell him that it would all be okay. But the fear, that ever-present warden, held me back. Such a gesture would be a step over a line we'd never acknowledged, a line I had spent 2 years diligently policing. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went into the kitchen and made him a cup of tea, the same peppermint blend he always drank when he was here. My hands were shaking slightly as I poured the hot water. When I came back into the living room, he hadn't moved. I placed the mug on the coffee table in front of him. "Here," I said softly. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked at the steaming mug, then at me, and for a fleeting moment, his gaze was so full of raw, unguarded need that it felt like a physical blow. It was a look that said more than any words could. It said, "I'm falling apart, and I don't know where else to go." He didn't drink the tea. He just stared into the middle distance as I sat in the armchair opposite him, a silent sentinel. The only sounds were the rain against the glass and the occasional, shuddering breath he took. Hours seemed to pass. The light outside faded, and my apartment grew dim around us. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick. Can I just stay here tonight, Leo? I can't be alone in my place. It's too empty." The request hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It wasn't a question of logistics. His apartment was 30 feet away. It was a question of sanctuary. He was asking for shelter, not from the rain, but from himself. "Of course," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Take the couch. You know where the blankets are." He gave me a small, grateful nod, the first flicker of the real Julian I'd seen all evening. That night, as I lay in my own bed, listening to the sound of his soft, even breathing from the other room, I knew something fundamental had changed. He had come to me in a moment of crisis, choosing my quiet space over his own. He had chosen me, and I knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that this was only the beginning. And so the ritual began. It started with that one night, but it didn't end there. The failed Chicago deal seemed to have knocked something loose in Julian, a foundational pin that held his polished, self-sufficient world together. He was still the charming, energetic Julian to everyone else, but with me, in the quiet sanctuary of my apartment, he was different. He was quieter, more vulnerable. The pretense of just crashing for a night, after a late work session or a long trip, slowly dissolved into an unspoken arrangement. More often than not, I would come home to find him already there, or he would show up at my door around 10, looking tired, a silent plea in his eyes. He never had to ask anymore. I would just nod him in, and he would gravitate to the sofa as if pulled by an invisible string. Our evenings fell into a new, comfortable pattern. He would work on his laptop while I edited photos, the silence between us filled only by the click of his keys and the soft shutter sound from my computer. It was a domesticity that felt both beautifully natural and dangerously fragile. I became a student of his exhaustion. I learned to read the subtle gradations in the slump of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes, the degree to which his smile failed to reach them. On the bad days, he would barely speak. He would just lie on the couch, one arm thrown over his eyes, and just be. He wasn't sleeping, not always. He was just still, as if the world outside my apartment was too loud, too demanding, and this was the only place he could find silence. I never pushed him to talk. I just let him be, orbiting him quietly, making sure his tea was warm, keeping the lights low. I felt like I was tending to a rare, delicate plant that had been exposed to a harsh climate and was slowly, tentatively, learning to trust the soil again. My apartment had become his greenhouse, a place of controlled, gentle atmosphere where he could recover. And I, the quiet gardener, was terrified of doing anything that might upset the delicate balance required for him to heal. The first time the line blurred irrevocably was a month into this new routine. It was a cold November night, and a faulty radiator in my building had left my apartment frigid. I was huddled under a pile of blankets on my bed, reading, when Julian came in from the living room, a comforter wrapped around his shoulders like a cape. He stood in the doorway, hesitating. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet. "It's freezing out there. The couch is like a block of ice." I looked at him, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. I knew what was coming next. The air in the room crackled with it. "My couch is killing my back anyway," he added, a little too quickly. It was the flimsiest of pretexts, a transparent excuse that we both knew was a lie. He was an athlete in his college days. A night on a sofa wasn't going to break him. This wasn't about comfort. It was about proximity. I held my breath, the pages of my book forgotten in my lap. The space between us was a vast, charged chasm. My bed was my last line of defense, the final, most intimate sanctuary within my sanctuary. To invite him in was to surrender my last piece of protected territory. But looking at him standing there, looking so lost and cold, my self-preservation crumbled. I folded back the corner of my duvet in a silent invitation. "There's enough room. I said, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't smile. He just nodded, a look of profound relief washing over his face. He walked over and slid into the bed, keeping a careful, respectful distance between us. He lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, the comforter he'd brought with him still clutched around his shoulders like a shield. Thanks, he whispered into the darkness. We lay there for a long time, two bodies in the same bed, separated by a gulf of unspoken feelings wider than the few inches of mattress between us. The silence was deafening, filled with the sound of my own frantic pulse. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a tantalizing warmth in the cold room. I could smell the faint, familiar scent of his shampoo on the pillow. It was torture. It was heaven. That night established a new, even more dangerous ritual. The couch was tacitly abandoned. His excuse was always his back, or the cold, or a draft from the window. I never called him on it. I simply accepted the new arrangement. My life bifurcated into two distinct realities. There was the daytime Leo, the professional, friendly photographer who was just good friends with his neighbor. And then there was the nighttime Leo, the man who lay awake for hours, every nerve ending alight, hyper-aware of the man sleeping peacefully beside him. Sometimes, in the depths of the night, he would shift in his sleep, an arm or a leg brushing against me. Each accidental touch was like a jolt of electricity, sending a shockwave through my system. I would freeze, waiting to see if he would pull away, but he never did. He would just sigh softly and settle in closer, seeking warmth in his unconscious state. In those moments, I would allow myself a sliver of hope. I would let myself believe that this wasn't just about comfort or convenience, that his body knew something his conscious mind hadn't yet figured out. I began to see our nights together as a kind of slow-motion development process, like an image emerging in a tray of developer. In the dark, hidden from the harsh light of day, a picture was forming. It was faint, its outlines blurry and uncertain, but it was there. I was terrified of exposing it to the light too soon, of fixing the image before it was fully formed, leaving us with a pale, underdeveloped ghost of what could have been. So I existed in the half-light, in the ambiguity, analyzing every small gesture, every sleepy murmur, every accidental touch. I cataloged them like precious data points, searching for a pattern, for proof that my hypothesis was correct. His hand brushing mine as we reached for the remote. The way his eyes would soften when he looked at me after a long, hard day. The time he fell asleep on the couch before graduating to my bed, his head lolling onto my shoulder, and I sat there for 2 hours, my arm numb, just to let him rest. Each instance was a clue, a breadcrumb on a trail I hoped was leading us somewhere beautiful, and not just to the edge of a cliff. One evening, he came home from a 2-day trip to Boston looking more drained than I had ever seen him. He dropped his bag by the door, bypassed the living room entirely, and walked straight into my bedroom, where I was sorting through a recent shoot on my laptop. He didn't say a word. He just toed off his shoes and crawled onto the bed, fully dressed, and curled up on his side, his back to me. The gesture was so uncharacteristically vulnerable, so devoid of any pretext, that it winded me. I stopped what I was doing and just watched the gentle rise and fall of his back. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just taking up the space he now considered his, the safe harbor he knew would be waiting for him. After a few minutes of silence, I quietly closed my laptop, slid it onto the nightstand, and lay down on my side, facing his back. I didn't touch him. I just lay there, a few inches away, letting my presence be a silent source of comfort. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice muffled by the pillow. "They're promoting me," I waited. This didn't sound like the news of a man who had just crawled into bed in defeat. "It's more money," he continued, his voice flat. "More responsibility. More travel. More of all of it." He rolled over then, his face etched with a profound and weary conflict. Everyone was congratulating me, taking me out for drinks. And all I could think about was how much I wanted to be here, in this quiet room, where I don't have to be anything. His eyes, usually so bright and full of life, were cloudy with confusion. "What is wrong with me, Leo?" The question was so raw, so honest, It stole the air from my lungs. He was looking at me as if I had the answer, as if I held the map to his own bewildering emotional landscape. And in that moment, all my analysis, all my fear, all my carefully constructed theories melted away, replaced by a singular, overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated love for this beautiful, lost man. "There's nothing wrong with you," I said, my voice thick. "You're just tired." It was the simplest truth, and yet it felt like a profound revelation. He held my gaze for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a flicker of understanding, of recognition. He reached out then, not accidentally, not in his sleep, but with a clear and deliberate purpose. He didn't grab my hand or touch my face. He just gently took the hem of my t-shirt between his thumb and forefinger, holding onto it like a lifeline. It was the smallest of gestures, yet it was the most definitive thing he had ever done. It was an admission. It was a request. It was a confession without words. He closed his eyes, his thumb rubbing the soft cotton in a slow, rhythmic motion. And I lay there, perfectly still, my entire universe shrinking down to that single point of contact, the fragile thread connecting his world to mine. The image in the developer was becoming clearer, the lines sharper. Something was about to come into focus. I was terrified, and I was ready. The night it happened was different. The air itself felt different, charged and heavy, like the atmosphere before a summer thunderstorm. The ritual had become so ingrained in our lives that it no longer required any justification. He would finish his work, I would finish mine, and we would gravitate toward my bedroom as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But tonight, the usual comfortable silence was replaced by a palpable tension. We lay in bed, side by side on our backs, staring at the ceiling as shadows from the passing cars danced across it. Neither of us was tired. Our bodies were humming with a nervous energy that kept sleep at bay. I could feel him thinking, just as I was sure he could feel me thinking. The unspoken thing that lived between us was no longer a quiet guest in the room. It was a living, breathing entity, taking up all the oxygen. He had been quiet all evening, but it wasn't the tired quiet I was used to. It was a pensive, restless quiet. He'd paced my apartment for a while, picking up books and putting them down without reading them, staring out the window at the city lights. He was a caged animal, prowling the confines of a space that was suddenly too small to contain whatever was churning inside him. Now, in the dark, his stillness was just as loud as his pacing had been. I could feel the coiled energy in him, the tension in the line of his shoulder just inches from mine. I wanted to say something, to break the spell, but my throat was tight with a familiar fear. What if I said the wrong thing? What if I shattered this fragile, precious thing by naming it? So I remained silent, my heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs, waiting for him to make the first move. It was always him who initiated, who pushed the boundary just a little further. I was the observer, the reactor. It was the role I had assigned myself, the only one I felt safe playing. Finally, he turned his head on the pillow to look at me. I didn't have to see him to know. I could feel his gaze on the side of my face, a tangible weight. I slowly turned to meet his eyes. In the dim light filtering in from the street, they were dark pools of unreadable emotion. We just looked at each other for a long, breathless moment. The world seemed to fall away, the sounds of the city fading into a distant hum. There was only the space between us, electric and alive. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. It was the way he said my name, imbued with a gravity it had never held before. It wasn't a call for attention. It was a statement, a question, an entire conversation packed into a single word. "Julian," I whispered back, my own voice unsteady. He didn't say anything else for a moment. His eyes searched mine, and I felt utterly exposed, as if he could see straight into my soul, to the secret garden I had been tending for years. I saw the conflict in his face, the fear warring with a powerful, undeniable need. And then, I saw the fear lose. A decision was made. It was there in the subtle softening of his jaw, the slight parting of his lips. He took a breath, a small, shaky intake of air. "Would it be okay?" he began, his voice barely audible. If I kissed you? The question hung in the air between us, shimmering and fragile. It was not a proposition. It was a plea. It was a request for permission, an act of profound vulnerability from a man who was used to taking charge, to being in control. He wasn't assuming, he was asking. He was giving me all the power to say no, the power to keep the walls of our friendship intact, the power to shatter his heart with a single word. In that moment, he laid his own heart bare, offering it to me with open hands. And all my fear, all my carefully constructed defenses, all the reasons I had told myself this could never happen, they all evaporated like mist in the morning sun. All that was left was the simple, undeniable truth that had been living inside me for 2 years. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. My throat was closed tight with a surge of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown me. Instead, I just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But he saw it. A wave of relief, so profound it was almost painful to watch, washed over his features. He moved slowly, tentatively, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. He lifted a hand and gently, so gently, cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. His skin was warm, a little rough. The touch was electric, 1,000 volts of stored energy finally finding its release. He leaned in, and I closed my eyes, my entire being focused on the impending contact. His lips met mine not with passion or fire, but with a soft, hesitant reverence. It was a question, a discovery, a quiet landing after a long and turbulent flight. It was the taste of salt and relief. It was the feeling of coming home. The kiss was not an explosion. It was a quiet unfolding. It was gentle, searching, a conversation held without language. It spoke of weeks of unspoken tension, of months of shared silences, of years of hidden affection. His thumb continued its slow, soothing caress against my skin as his lips moved against mine with a tenderness that unraveled me completely. All the anxiety I had been holding in my muscles, all the breath I had been holding in my lungs, it all released in a single, shuddering sigh. I lifted my own hand, my fingers trembling slightly, and rested it on his chest, right over his heart. It was hammering against his ribs just as frantically as my own, a wild, synchronous rhythm that bound us together in the quiet dark. This was real. This wasn't a dream, or a misinterpretation, or a moment of accidental intimacy. This was a choice. A mutual, terrifying, beautiful choice. When he finally pulled back, it was only by an inch. He rested his forehead against mine, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. His eyes were still closed. "Leo," he whispered again, his voice thick with emotion. It sounded like a prayer. I opened my eyes and just looked at the face that was so close to mine, the face I knew better than my own. The scar on his eyebrow, the faint lines around his eyes. I traced the line of his jaw with my thumb, a gesture I had dreamed of making 1,000 times. He leaned into my touch, a soft sound of contentment escaping his lips. There were a million things I could have said in that moment. I could have told him I loved him. I could have told him I had been waiting for this for what felt like a lifetime. I could have asked him what this meant, where we were going. But the words felt clumsy and inadequate, blunt instruments for such a delicate, sacred moment. The silence was more honest. So I said the only thing that felt true. Stay. It was a command, a plea, a promise. It meant stay here, in this bed, tonight. It meant don't run away from this in the morning. It meant stay here, in my life, like this. He opened his eyes, and they were clear now, the confusion washed away, replaced by a deep, quiet certainty that mirrored my own. He didn't need to ask what I meant. He understood. He gave me a small, slow smile, not his usual charming, public smile, but a private, intimate one I had never seen before. It was a smile that reached all the way to his eyes and made them shine, even in the darkness. "Okay," he breathed. He kissed me again, deeper this time, a kiss of confirmation, of arrival. And as I kissed him back, I felt the last of my fear dissolve. The image was fixed. The picture was finally clear. And it was more beautiful than anything I could have ever hoped to capture. The morning after was a study in silence, but a new kind of silence. It wasn't the tense, questioning silence of the night before, or the comfortable, platonic silence of the months past. It was a fragile, shimmering silence, like the air after a snowfall, pristine, hushed, and easily disturbed. I woke first. The sun was just beginning to spill weak, gray light into the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Julian was still asleep, his face turned toward me, his expression one of complete peace. His arm was thrown across my waist, his hand resting on my hip, a casual anchor. The sight of it, so possessive and so natural, sent a fresh wave of something warm and sharp through my chest. For a long while, I just lay there, unmoving, committing the image to memory. I was a photographer, and this was a perfect composition. The soft light, the tangled sheets, the unguarded beauty of his sleeping face. It was a picture I knew I would carry with me forever. But as the minutes ticked by and the city outside began to stir, a familiar anxiety started to creep back in, a cold tendril winding its way around the warmth in my chest. The night had been a dream, a pocket of impossible reality carved out of the darkness. But the morning was real. The morning brought consequences. What would happen when he woke up? Would he be filled with regret? Would he pull away, the harsh light of day revealing the mistake he'd made? The fear that I had misinterpreted everything, that I had only been a port in his emotional storm, came rushing back. I carefully, slowly, began to detangle myself from him, needing to put some space between us, to prepare myself for the inevitable retreat I was sure was coming. I had just managed to slide my leg out from under his when his eyes fluttered open. He blinked a few times, disoriented, and then his gaze focused on me. For a split second, there was nothing but soft, sleepy recognition. And then awareness dawned. His eyes widened slightly. I saw the memory of the kiss, of the entire night, flood into his expression. And then I saw it, the flicker of panic. He pulled his arm back from my waist as if he'd been burned. He sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair, and pointedly refused to look at me. The beautiful, shimmering silence was shattered, and the air filled with the jagged pieces of it. He started, his voice rough with sleep. He cleared his throat. I should go. I have an early meeting. It was a lie. I knew his schedule. His first call wasn't until 10. The cold dread I had been anticipating solidified in my stomach, heavy and sick. He was gone in less than 5 minutes. He moved with a frantic, clumsy haste, gathering his things, not meeting my eyes, muttering apologies about the mess. He didn't say goodbye. He just slipped out the door, closing it quietly behind him, leaving me alone in the sudden, deafening emptiness of my apartment. I stood in the middle of my living room, the scent of him still lingering in the air, the indentation of his head still on the pillow in my bedroom. It was as if the last 12 hours hadn't happened. It was as if I had dreamed the whole thing. The warmth and certainty of the night had been a cruel illusion, and the morning had brought the cold, hard reality I had always feared. I had let myself hope. I had let myself believe. And now, the silence he left behind was not peaceful or comfortable. It was a void. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on a possibility I had just begun to believe in. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. They were a return to the time before the power outage, but worse. Before, we were friendly strangers. Now, we were intimate strangers, bound by a shared memory that he was desperately trying to erase. He avoided me. It was a clumsy, obvious avoidance that was more painful than any direct confrontation could have been. If he heard my door open, he would wait until I was gone to leave his own apartment. I saw him once, waiting for the elevator, and he pretended to be engrossed in his phone, his shoulders tense, until the doors opened, and he practically lunged inside, pressing the door close button with frantic urgency. His texts, when he sent them at all, were brief and professional, responses to my tentative questions about his week. Busy. Talk later, but later never came. The ritual was broken. My evenings were silent and empty. The couch remained unoccupied. My bed felt unnervingly large and cold. His absence was a physical presence in my apartment, a ghost that sat in his usual spot, a constant, painful reminder of what I had lost, or what I had never truly had. My mind became a torture chamber of self-recrimination. I replayed the night over and over again, analyzing every word, every gesture, searching for the moment I went wrong. Had I been too eager? Had my nod been a misinterpretation of his question? Was his kiss just a moment of confused, exhausted gratitude that I had blown up into something more? The quiet observer in me had failed. My perception, the one skill I had always trusted, had betrayed me. I had developed the photo too soon, and the image was a distorted, horrifying version of what I'd hoped for. The pain was a dull, constant ache behind my ribs, a physical manifestation of my foolish, broken heart. After a week of this agonizing silence, something inside me snapped. I couldn't live in this limbo anymore. The ambiguity that had once been a source of thrilling tension was now an unbearable weight. I needed to know. Even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine, it had to be better than this suffocating uncertainty. I waited until I knew he was home, his lights a warm, taunting glow across the hall. I took a deep breath, walked out of my apartment, and knocked on his door. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway, a definitive, irreversible act. I could hear movement inside, a pause. I knew he was looking through the peephole, debating whether to pretend he wasn't there. My heart hammered against my chest. Finally, after a small eternity, the lock clicked and the door opened a few inches. He stood there, looking haggard. He was still in his work clothes, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed with fatigue and something else, guilt. He blocked the doorway, his body language a clear barrier. "Leo," he said, his voice low. "Now's not a great time. I don't need a lot of time," I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. The hurt had burned away the fear, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. "I just need you to be honest with me, Julian. Because this silence is killing me." He flinched at my words, his gaze finally meeting mine. I saw the conflict raging there, the same conflict I had seen the night of the kiss, but now it was sharper, more painful. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, looking at the floor. "I've been a jerk." "I don't care if you've been a jerk," I said, my voice rising slightly despite my best efforts to control it. "I care about why. What happened, Julian? That night, did I imagine it? Did I misread everything?" He finally looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The sight of his pain, so raw and real, momentarily eclipsed my own. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You didn't imagine it." He leaned his forehead against the doorframe, closing his eyes. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo. I panicked. Panicked about what?" I pressed, my voice softening slightly. "About me? About us?" He shook his head, a gesture of profound confusion. "About everything," he said, his voice muffled. "You and me, it's not logical. It doesn't fit into the plan. My job, my life, the things I'm supposed to want. And then there's you. And being with you, in your apartment, it feels more real than any of it. It's the only place I feel like I can breathe." He took a shaky breath. "That night, when I kissed you, it was the most honest thing I've done in years. And it terrified me, because it meant that everything else, the whole life I've built, might be a lie." His confession hung in the air between us, a raw, painful, and beautiful truth. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was running from the implications of a feeling that threatened to upend his entire, carefully curated world. He was a man who lived by logic and reason, a consultant who solved problems and followed clear paths. And I was an unsolvable problem, a path leading into an unknown wilderness. The anger and hurt inside me began to recede, replaced by a wave of deep, aching empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of accepting what I represented, a different kind of life, a different kind of happiness, one that he never planned for and didn't know how to navigate. I reached out and gently placed my hand on his arm, over the expensive fabric of his work shirt. He didn't pull away. "So you just disappear?" I asked softly. "You run away and leave me thinking it was all in my head, that I was just convenient." He finally opened his eyes and looked at me, his expression full of remorse. "That was cowardly," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "And cruel. I'm so sorry, Leo. I was just so scared. Scared of ruining the one good thing in my life, our friendship, and scared of what it would mean if it was more. The silence stretched between us again, but this time it was different. It was a space for honesty, a clearing in the woods where we could finally see each other. My life is full of rooms, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Wardrooms, hotel rooms, waiting rooms. They're all temporary. I'm just passing through. But your apartment, it's not a room. It's a home. And that night, our night, it felt like I was finally home. He swallowed hard. I've never had that before, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I ran back to the only thing I know. The temporary rooms. The metaphor was so stark, so painful, that it made my chest ache. He wasn't just a consultant. He was a tourist in his own life, and he had stumbled into a place that felt permanent, and the permanence had scared him witless. I didn't have a grand speech. I didn't have a solution to his existential crisis. All I had was the simple, unwavering truth of my own feelings. You don't have to have it all figured out, Julian, I said quietly. You just have to stop running. I squeezed his arm gently. Just come back. We can figure the rest out together. Slowly, he searched my face, looking for a catch, for a trap. But all he found was the same steady affection that had been there all along. He had tried to slam the door on it, but the door had never locked. I had left it open for him. Slowly, tentatively, he nodded, and then he did something that surprised me. He stepped back, pulling the door to his own apartment fully open. It was an invitation, an apology, a beginning. Come in, he said, and for the first time, I crossed the threshold from the hallway into his world. His apartment was the mirror opposite of mine, where my space was filled with the curated clutter of my life. Stacks of art books, camera lenses on shelves, prints leaning against the walls. His was minimalist and impersonal. It looked like a high-end hotel suite, stylish but sterile. There were no photos on the walls, no personal trinkets, nothing to suggest the vibrant, complex man who lived there. It was the space of someone who was never really home, someone just passing through. The sight of it solidified everything he had just confessed. He had built a life that looked perfect from the outside, but it was an empty set, a beautiful hollow shell, and he had been slowly, unconsciously, seeking refuge from it in the lived-in, slightly chaotic warmth of my life. We didn't talk much more that night. The words had been said. The truth was out, lying raw and vulnerable between us. He made us tea, using the same peppermint blend he'd adopted from me, and we sat on his uncomfortable, stylish sofa. He didn't try to touch me, and I didn't push. The physical intimacy could wait. What we needed now was to rebuild the foundation that his fear had fractured. We needed to reestablish the safety and trust that had been the bedrock of our friendship. So we sat in a comfortable silence, a silence that felt earned, a silence that was healing. He told me about the project that was causing him so much stress, and I listened, really listened. I told him about a new series of photos I was planning, and he asked the same insightful, curious questions he always had. We were finding our way back to each other, not by ignoring what had happened, but by remembering who we were before it. When it grew late, a new, unspoken question hung in the air. Where would we sleep? The thought of returning to our separate apartments felt like a step backward, a retreat. But returning to the loaded intimacy of my bed felt like moving too fast. He seemed to be wrestling with the same dilemma. Finally, I stood up. I should get going, I said, testing the waters. He looked up at me, a flicker of the old panic in his eyes. No, he said, too quickly. Don't. Please. He looked around his own empty apartment, at the sterile perfection he had created. I don't want to be alone here. He looked at me, his gaze full of a new, hesitant hope. Could we just go back to your place? And just be? It was the perfect solution. A return to the sanctuary, but with a new set of rules we would write together. We walked the 30 feet back down the hall, a journey we had made 100 times, but this time it felt different. It felt intentional. When we entered my apartment, the familiar, comfortable clutter felt like a warm embrace. He breathed out a sigh that seemed to come from the deepest part of him, a sigh of profound relief. Home, he murmured, so softly I almost didn't hear it. That night, we slept in my bed again. But it was different from all the nights before. There was no pretense. There was no ambiguity. He turned to me in the dark, and this time, there was no hesitation. He simply opened his arms, and I went into them without a second thought. I rested my head on his chest, his arms wrapping securely around me, holding me close. His chin came to rest on the top of my head. There were no kisses, no searching touches. There was just the solid, steady beat of his heart under my ear, a rhythm that was both calming and exhilarating. It was the sound of a promise. It was the sound of a beginning. The days and weeks that followed were a process of gentle recalibration. We were no longer just friends, but we weren't quite a couple in the traditional sense. We were something in between, something we were building ourselves, without a blueprint. We were learning a new language, one spoken not in grand declarations, but in small, intentional acts of care. It was in the way he started leaving things at my apartment, a toothbrush in a cup by the sink, a change of clothes in my closet, his favorite coffee mug claiming a permanent spot on my dish rack. Each item was a quiet anchor, a small claim on the space, a testament to his intention to stay. It was in the way I learned to make space for him, not just on my sofa, but in my life, in my routines. I started buying his brand of coffee. I cleared a shelf for him in the bathroom. I found I was composing my photographs with a new sense of light, a warmth that I hadn't realized was missing before. The fear didn't vanish overnight. I would still catch him, sometimes, looking at me with a flicker of that old panic, that this isn't logical confusion. But now, instead of running, he would talk about it. He would voice his anxieties about his job, about the future, about whether he was capable of this kind of happiness. And I would listen. I wouldn't offer easy answers, because I didn't have them. I would just be there, a steady presence, my hand finding his, a silent reassurance that he wasn't navigating this new territory alone. We were two explorers, charting a map together, one day at a time. The physical intimacy grew, too, but it grew from this new root of emotional honesty. Kisses were no longer fraught with tension and uncertainty. They were soft, easy affirmations, a way of saying, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We learned the landscape of each other's bodies with the same slow, reverent curiosity with which we were learning each other's hearts. One Saturday afternoon, I was in my darkroom, the red light casting an eerie, beautiful glow over everything. I was working on a print from a series I'd started after he and I had found our new rhythm. It was a street scene, but instead of focusing on the harsh lines of the buildings, I had focused on a couple huddled together under an umbrella, their forms blurred into a single shape, a small island of warmth in the rain. I was so engrossed in the process, watching the image slowly appear in the developer tray, that I didn't hear the door open. Can I come in? Julian's voice was soft, hesitant not to disturb me. It's a darkroom, I said with a smile, not looking up. The whole point is that it's dark, he chuckled and slipped inside, closing the door behind him, plunging us into the serene, ruby-tinted world. He came to stand beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. He watched the tray, his expression rapt, as the image of the couple grew clearer and more defined. That's beautiful, he whispered. What is it? It's a new series, I said, carefully lifting the print with a pair of tongs and moving it to the stop bath. I'm calling it Sanctuary. He was quiet for a moment, the only sound the gentle sloshing of the chemicals. Like your apartment, he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. I looked at him then. In the strange, forgiving red light, his face was all soft shadows and gentle planes. The usual sharpness of his features was gone, replaced by a quiet vulnerability that still made my heart ache. Yes, I said. Like my apartment. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His hand was wet with developer, and mine was wet with stop bath. It didn't matter. No, he said softly, his gaze intense. Not just your apartment, Leo. You're the sanctuary. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of chemicals and coffee and the undeniable truth of what we had become. It was a kiss that held the memory of a darkened hallway, of a rainy night, of 1,000 silent moments on a worn-out sofa. It was the culmination of a long, slow development process, an image finally brought into the light, fixed and permanent. We were no longer an observer and an initiator, no longer a gardener and a delicate plant. We were just two people, two men, who had found a home in each other. Life is not a single, perfectly composed photograph. It is a messy, chaotic, and beautiful collection of moments, of exposures, of images developed and discarded. Some are blurry with uncertainty, some are overexposed by fear, and some are so perfectly clear they take your breath away. You can spend your whole life behind the lens, trying to capture it, to control it, to keep it at a safe distance. But the real moments, the ones that change you, are the ones that happen when you put the camera down. They happen in the dark, in the quiet, when you are brave enough to let someone else in, to let their world bleed into yours. They happen when you realize that the safest place you can be is not in a room you have built for yourself, but in the open, honest, and terrifyingly beautiful space you build with another. We didn't need a plan. We didn't need a map. We just needed to be brave enough to stay, to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned how to create together.